Two Apache clans started a war. The rancher's land was right in the middle. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Picture this, a vast stretch of land in the western United States, where the sun sets behind the jagged mountains and the wind whispers across the open plains. This was the ranch of one man, a solitary rancher named Samuel. He had spent years cultivating his piece of earth, turning it from barren land into a prosperous ranch. But little did he know, the land he had worked so hard for was about to become the epicenter of a devastating conflict. Samuel had always lived a quiet life, far from the bustling towns and cities. His days were filled with tending to cattle and maintaining his ranch. He preferred the isolation, the peace that came with being far removed from the world's chaos. But one fateful day, everything changed. Two Apache clans, the Thunderfoot and the Black River tribes, had been at odds for generations. The reasons for their feud were long and tangled, rooted in land disputes and ancient grudges. But recently, their conflict had escalated, and both tribes were determined to claim more territory. Unfortunately for Samuel, his ranch lay right between their territories, a piece of land both clans desperately wanted. The first signs of trouble came when a group of Thunderfoot warriors arrived at Samuel's ranch. They were fierce and proud, their faces painted with symbols of their tribe's history. They demanded that Samuel give up part of his land, claiming it was rightfully theirs. Samuel, a man of honor and strength, refused. He had worked too hard for this land to give it up without a fight. The Thunderfoot warriors, seeing his defiance, gave him an ultimatum: leave or face the consequences. Before Samuel could respond, the Black River tribe arrived. Their warriors, equally fierce, had heard of the Thunderfoot's demands and saw an opportunity to claim the land for themselves. What followed was a tense standoff, with both tribes on the brink of war. Samuel found himself trapped in the middle, his once peaceful ranch now the stage for a bitter struggle. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, his land, his home, and everything he had worked for could be lost forever. But what could one man do against two powerful tribes? The answer, Samuel realized, lay not in violence, but in his ability to outwit the clans and find a solution that would keep his land safe. But first, he needed to figure out how to survive the next few days. The fate of his ranch rested on his shoulders, and time was running out. As Samuel stood there, facing the two Apache tribes, his heart pounded in his chest. The Thunderfoot clan had made their demands, and now the Black River tribe was throwing their weight into the mix. It was a standoff like no other. The land Samuel had fought so hard to build up from nothing was now the epicenter of a conflict between two powerful forces. He had no choice but to stand firm, but deep down, he knew that he couldn't face them head-on with brute force alone. The odds were against him, and his ranch was too valuable to simply hand over. But Samuel was not a man who gave up easily. He was resourceful, and he had learned over the years that it was often better to outthink his opponents rather than overpower them. As both tribes circled, sizing each other up, Samuel's mind raced. He knew the Thunderfoot clan was fiercely proud, their warriors respected for their strength and honor. The Black River tribe, on the other hand, was known for its cunning and its ability to move quickly. Between the two, Samuel realized that he had to play to the one advantage he had, his knowledge of the land. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and sage, and Samuel knew it was time to make his move. He raised his hand, signaling both clans to wait. He had an idea, but it would require him to take a huge risk. With both clans watching him, Samuel spoke calmly but with authority. He proposed a challenge. If either of the clans could prove that their claim to the land was more valid than the other, he would hand over the portion they desired. But if neither could prove their case, they would have to leave his ranch in peace. The challenge was simple. Each clan had to provide a sacred artifact that was tied to their claim of the land. The clan that could prove their connection to the land through their artifact would gain the right to claim it. The Thunderfoot clan leader, a tall man with a weathered face and sharp eyes, was the first to speak. He agreed to the challenge, but warned Samuel that his clan would not back down easily. The Black River tribe's leader, a woman with a commanding presence and a deep voice, also accepted. She smiled slightly, a glint of respect in her eyes. "We will show you our proof," she said, "but be ready for the consequences." As the tribes began to prepare for the challenge, Samuel felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had no idea what they would bring to the table, but he had to trust that his idea would be enough to buy him the time he needed. He couldn't afford to lose his land, not after everything he had built. The next morning, the two clans gathered at Samuel's ranch. They stood in a tense silence, their warriors ready for whatever would come next. Samuel stood at the center, facing the leaders of the Thunderfoot and Black River tribes. He felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he knew he had to remain calm. The Thunderfoot leader stepped forward first. He held out a small, intricately carved bone, a symbol of his clan's connection to the land. "This is the bone of our ancestors," he said. "It has been passed down through generations, and it proves our claim to this land." Samuel studied the artifact carefully. It was old, worn, but undeniably important to the Thunderfoot tribe. But it wasn't enough. He turned to the Black River leader, waiting for her to present her clan's proof. The woman reached into her pouch and pulled out a beautifully crafted stone. It glistened in the sunlight, a rare artifact from the Black River tribe's sacred grounds. "This is the stone that marks the boundary of our territory," she said, her voice steady. "It has been passed down for centuries, and it is the key to our claim." Samuel's eyes narrowed. The stone was impressive, but it wasn't the only factor that would determine the fate of his land. He had to make sure that neither clan could accuse him of favoring the other. With both artifacts in hand, Samuel stood in silence, feeling the tension in the air. The stakes had never been higher, and he knew that his next move would be crucial. The challenge had begun, and now it was up to the clans to prove their worth. But Samuel also had something up his sleeve, something they hadn't anticipated. He had spent years studying the land, learning its secrets, and he was about to reveal the one thing that neither clan could contest. The wind howled through the open plains, the tension in the air palpable as the two Apache clans waited for Samuel to make his move. Both the Thunderfoot and Black River tribes had presented their sacred artifacts, but Samuel knew that this was only the beginning. The stakes had never been higher. The land he had worked so hard to cultivate was on the line, and he had to make sure that neither clan could lay claim to it without contest. He had studied the land for years, learning its secrets and hidden resources, and now he was about to reveal the one thing that neither clan could dispute. As he stood there, holding both artifacts in his hands, Samuel spoke calmly but firmly. "I see the value of these artifacts," he said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "But this land is not just about symbols and stones. It's about what's beneath the earth, what's hidden in the soil. And I have something here that neither of you can deny." With that, Samuel turned and walked toward the nearby hill, gesturing for the clan leaders to follow him. The warriors of both tribes exchanged uneasy glances but followed in silence. Samuel had led them to the farthest corner of his land, where the dry earth had always seemed barren. But beneath that surface, Samuel knew, lay something far more valuable than any artifact: water. Years of drought had made the land appear inhospitable, but Samuel had discovered a hidden water source, deep beneath the surface, flowing steadily enough to sustain an entire community. He had dug a well years ago, and since then, it had provided enough water to support his ranch and the surrounding land. The Apache tribes had no idea that this land was not just fertile for crops and grazing cattle, but that it was home to a precious resource that could change the course of their conflict. Samuel reached the spot where the well was hidden, a small structure built into the ground, designed to blend in with the natural landscape. He motioned for the two clan leaders to approach. "This," Samuel said as he pointed to the ground, "is why this land is mine. Beneath this earth is a freshwater source. This is what will sustain you, your people, and your cattle. It's not about who has the most sacred artifacts. It's about who understands the true value of this land." The Thunderfoot leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Kanthi, stepped forward, his face a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He knelt down, brushing his fingers over the earth. "Water," he muttered, his voice low. "This could change everything." The Black River leader, a woman named Ayana, watched silently, her sharp eyes narrowing as she considered the implications. "And you've kept this hidden all these years?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "I didn't want anyone to know. Not until it was too late to take it from me." The two Apache leaders exchanged a long, silent glance. The discovery of water was a game-changer. Both clans had been struggling with limited resources, and the promise of fresh water was something neither could ignore. But the question remained, who would control it? Kanthi stood up, his posture still tense. "You say the water is yours," he said slowly. "But you've already made your choice by keeping it from us. Why should we trust you?" Samuel met his gaze. "Because I'm offering it to both of you. I'm not asking you to fight over this land. I'm asking you to share it. If we work together, we can use the land, the water, and the resources to survive and thrive. But if you continue fighting, we'll all lose." Ayana's eyes softened, and she stepped forward, her voice steady. "You want us to work together?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "After all the bloodshed between our people?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, because if we don't, we'll all be destroyed by the same thing that brought us to this point, our pride and our refusal to compromise." The clan stood in silence, the weight of Samuel's words sinking in. This was more than just a battle for land. This was a test of whether they could put aside their differences for the sake of survival. The decision was theirs to make. Samuel had done all he could. He had offered them a chance to unite, to build something greater than their hatred and distrust. But would they accept his offer, or would they continue to fight, knowing that they could lose everything in the process? The next few moments felt like hours, the tension building with every passing second. Finally, Ayana spoke. "We will take your offer," she said quietly. "But know this, Samuel. If one of our people is harmed by the other, we will not hesitate to defend ourselves." Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I understand, and I will do everything I can to ensure that this land remains peaceful for all of us." As the two Apache leaders turned to their people, Samuel felt a sense of cautious optimism. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that was all a man could hope for. As the days passed, the air around Samuel's ranch remained heavy with anticipation. Both Apache clans had agreed to the challenge, but their uneasy truce hung in the balance. The sacred artifacts had been presented, and the discovery of the water beneath the earth had been the turning point. Now, Samuel was tasked with ensuring that this fragile peace would hold long enough for the clans to prove their willingness to cooperate. The work was not over. The land was still divided, with old wounds too deep to heal in a matter of days. But Samuel had done what he could to offer a solution, and now it was up to the clans to decide if they could live with it. The Thunderfoot clan had retreated to their camp, their warriors restless and uncertain. Kanthi, the leader, was a proud man, and Samuel knew that his acceptance of the offer had been grudging at best. Still, there had been no immediate signs of hostility. Ayana of the Black River tribe, however, had approached Samuel that evening with a proposition of her own. "We must prove to our people that this land is not just a battleground," she said, her voice low but steady. "It's not enough to simply claim it. We need to show them that we can coexist, that we can build something together." Samuel had agreed. There was no use in waiting for a conflict to spark when the opportunity to create something lasting was right in front of them. The next morning, both tribes gathered at the heart of Samuel's ranch. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a noticeable shift, an openness, albeit cautious. Samuel watched as Ayana stepped forward, holding the stone that had been presented as her clan's artifact. "We come to this land with both pride and humility," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "We do not seek to destroy what has already been built. We seek to build on what we can share." The Thunderfoot clan leader, Kanthi, stepped forward next, holding the bone of his ancestors. "Our claim to this land is not just for us," he said, his words weighed down by years of war and bitterness. "But we are willing to honor this place if it means survival for all." With that, the two leaders laid their sacred objects down side by side on the earth, symbolizing their agreement. The clans began to murmur among themselves, uncertain, but intrigued by the gesture. The warriors exchanged looks, their distrust evident but tempered by the possibility of peace. Samuel stood silently at the back of the gathering, watching as the clans took their first tentative steps toward a new future. It was a fragile moment, one that could easily crumble under the weight of old grudges. But for now it held. For days, the clans worked side by side, clearing land, digging irrigation channels, and sharing knowledge about the best crops to plant. There were still tensions, still moments of hesitation and distrust, but the daily work helped to ease the strain. Samuel noticed that the warriors of both clans, who had once eyed each other with suspicion, now exchanged nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship, but it was progress. Ayanna and Kanthi continued to meet with Samuel, discussing plans for the future. Slowly, they began to build something that resembled cooperation. The land, which had once been a battleground, was now the foundation for something far more powerful, a shared future. But even as things began to stabilize, Samuel knew that peace would never come easily. The clans had not forgotten their history, and the scars of the past were not easily healed. He had done his part, offering them a chance to work together. But the rest was up to them. The next few weeks were critical. Samuel spent long hours watching the land, making sure the agreements held. The weather, too, played a role. A heavy rainstorm came through, flooding some of the newly dug irrigation channels, but the clans worked together to repair the damage. It was small, but it was a symbol of something bigger. As the sun set one evening, Samuel stood at the edge of his land, watching the warriors work side by side. The distant hum of their labor was a sound he had not heard before on his ranch. It was the sound of cooperation, the sound of something new being built. Samuel knew there was still much work to be done. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead, but for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a sense of cautious hope. The land was healing, and so were the people. The fight was far from over, but for now, Samuel had done what he could. He had given them the chance to live, not as enemies, but as neighbors. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift he could offer. As the days stretched into weeks, the uneasy peace between the two Apache clans seemed to hold. The labor on Samuel's ranch continued, with warriors from both tribes working alongside each other. There were still moments of tension, a lingering distrust in the air, but the land, the shared goal of survival, began to slowly bridge the gap between them. Samuel had hoped for this kind of cooperation, but he knew the true test would come when things got tough. And tough they got. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered in the sky, the winds picked up, and soon a heavy storm swept across the plains. It wasn't just rain, it was a downpour, with thunder cracking across the sky and lightning illuminating the land in a bright flash. The river near Samuel's land, which had been relatively calm, quickly began to swell with the rainfall. What had once been a steady, reliable source of water for irrigation now threatened to flood the newly dug trenches. The soil, still soft from the recent irrigation work, began to wash away. Samuel knew that if the water level rose too high, it could ruin everything they had worked for. He wasted no time. He gathered the leaders of both clans, and, together, they rushed to the fields. The warriors worked quickly, but the rain was relentless. The water was rising faster than anyone could have anticipated, and it became clear that they would not be able to stop it alone. Samuel realized that they needed more than just manpower. They needed a plan that involved everyone, no matter their tribe. He turned to Ayanna, the Black River leader. We need to use the river to our advantage. If we dig a diversion channel to the north, we can redirect some of this water before it floods the entire ranch. Ayanna nodded, recognizing the urgency in Samuel's voice. She immediately gave orders to her people, and soon both clans were working together to dig the diversion channel. But the storm wasn't done with them yet. As they worked through the pouring rain, the ground beneath their feet began to shift, becoming slippery and unstable. There were moments when warriors slipped and fell, but they got back up and continued. There were no words of reproach, just a shared sense of determination to protect the land they had come to rely on. Kanthi, the Thunderfoot leader, moved to the front of the line, his men following him without hesitation. Samuel saw the change in him. A man who had once been an enemy, now working alongside him as if they had always been on the same side. It wasn't just the storm that had changed things, it was the realization that their fates were tied together. The work continued late into the night, but the diversion channel was finally completed just as the storm began to ease. The water was no longer threatening to overwhelm the ranch, but the damage was still significant. The flood had washed away much of the newly planted crops, and some of the irrigation channels had been destroyed. Samuel stood in the midst of the wreckage, watching as the last of the water drained away. The storm had passed, but the consequences of it would be felt for weeks. That was when he noticed something. The warriors, the men who had been fighting just weeks ago, were now gathering together, assessing the damage. They didn't argue or bicker. Instead, they went to work, repairing the irrigation system and salvaging what they could. Of the crops, there were still differences between the clans, still old wounds that needed to heal, but in that moment, they were all working together for the same cause. By the time the sun began to rise the next morning, the floodwater had receded, and the ranch was in a better state than Samuel had expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was still standing. Samuel looked around at the two Apache clans, their warriors working side by side, and he felt a strange sense of pride. This was the beginning of something bigger. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. It was about proving that they could overcome anything if they worked together. In the days that followed, the clans continued to work on the ranch, and though the tension never completely disappeared, it was now a different kind of tension. It was the kind that came with shared purpose, not hatred. Samuel had given them the chance to build something new, and in return, they had started to build something greater than land or possessions. They had started to build trust. As the last of the crops were harvested and the repairs were completed, Samuel stood in the center of his ranch, looking out at the land that had nearly been lost to war and nature. It wasn't just his land anymore. It was the land of two tribes, working together to create a future. And in that moment, Samuel realized that this land had already become something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. It was a symbol of hope, of what could be accomplished when people put aside their differences and came together for the common good. And as he watched the warriors continue their work, Samuel knew that this was only the beginning. As the weeks went by, the partnership between the Thunderfoot and Black River clans became more solid. The work was still difficult, the land unforgiving, but there was something new in the air, an unspoken understanding that they were no longer enemies. Samuel continued to watch the warriors, seeing how their hostility had slowly transformed into something more productive. It was a far cry from the bitter feud that had once defined the two tribes. One day, while Samuel was walking through the fields checking the progress of the crops, Ayanna approached him, her presence as strong as ever. "Samuel," she said, her voice steady, "we've been talking among ourselves. It's time to address the future of this land." Samuel turned to face her, the sun casting long shadows across the land. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious but curious. "We've come far," she began. "But there's still a question that lingers. What happens when the harvest is done? What happens when the peace you've worked so hard to establish begins to fade?" Samuel thought for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. The clans had come together to build something, but he knew it couldn't be sustained by just hard work alone. There had to be more. "You're right," Samuel said finally. "The work we've done is just the beginning. We need to make sure that this peace lasts, not just through the harvest, but for generations." Ayanna nodded. "We're willing to help with that, but we need a leader. Someone who can unite the clans when things get tough." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The responsibility of leadership weighed heavily on him. He had always been a solitary man, used to making decisions alone. But now, with two tribes depending on him, he realized that leadership meant more than just making decisions. It meant bringing people together and ensuring that everyone had a voice. He looked at Ayanna, knowing that she understood the gravity of the situation. "You want me to lead them?" he asked, unsure if he was ready for such a role. "I think you're the one who can do it," she replied. "You've proven that you can work with both clans, that you can bring us together. But it's not just about managing the land. It's about managing the people, keeping the peace. You've shown us that you can do that." Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He had never imagined himself as a leader, but the thought of the clans falling apart, of the peace they had worked so hard to build, made him realize that he couldn't walk away now. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll do it. But we need to make sure that both clans are equally represented. We need to create a council, a place where everyone has a say." Ayanna's eyes softened. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The two of them spent the next few days organizing the council. Samuel and Ayanna met with the leaders of both clans, and while the discussions were tense at times, there was a shared understanding that this was necessary for their future. The council was formed, with representatives from both the Thunderfoot and Black River tribes, and Samuel as the leader. It wasn't an easy process. Old wounds were still raw, and there were those who resisted the idea of working together. But over time, the council became a symbol of the peace they had fought for. As the first season of harvest ended, Samuel stood in the center of the land he had saved, watching as the clans worked together to prepare for the next year. The crops were plentiful, the land was thriving, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope for the future. But as the days grew longer and the seasons shifted, Samuel knew that peace was fragile. The clans had learned to coexist, but the test was far from over. He stood with Iana at the edge of the land, watching as the warriors prepared for the winter. "This isn't the end, is it?" Samuel asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No," Iana replied, "but it's a beginning, and that's all we can ask for." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. But as he looked at the clans working together, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had overcome so much, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel allowed himself to believe that the land, the people, and the peace they had fought for would survive, not just for one season, but for many more to come. As the winter months settled in, the work on the ranch slowed, but the peace that had been forged between the two Apache clans was still fragile. Samuel, now fully entrenched as the leader of the council, watched the land rest under the weight of snow. The crops were harvested, the cattle were kept safe, but the future was still uncertain. Samuel knew that even though the first test had been passed, there would be others. As the days grew colder, a new challenge emerged. News arrived from a neighboring region that a powerful band of raiders was moving toward their territory. The raiders were notorious for their brutality, taking what they wanted by force, and Samuel knew that if they came through the land, everything they had built could be destroyed in an instant. The clans were forced to unite once again, this time to defend the peace they had worked so hard to maintain. Samuel called for an emergency council meeting. Both Conthi and Iana were present, along with other representatives from the Thunderfoot and Black River clans. The air in the council room was tense, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. "These raiders won't stop unless we make it clear that we stand united," Samuel said, his voice steady but firm. "We cannot afford to let them tear apart the land and the people we've just begun to protect." Iana nodded in agreement. "We fought for the land, for our people. Now we fight to keep it. We cannot let outsiders destroy what we've built." Conthi, who had been quieter than usual, spoke up. "The raiders may come with numbers, but we have something they don't: this land. We know it better than they ever will. We can use that to our advantage." The council spent hours discussing their options, making plans to defend their land and their future. Everyone knew the raiders would not be an easy enemy to defeat, but the clans were no longer divided. They had learned the value of cooperation, and now they would put that to the ultimate test. Samuel, Conthi, Iana, and the rest of the warriors prepared for the battle that was sure to come. They moved quickly, gathering weapons, setting up defensive positions, and organizing the warriors. The storm of winter had passed, but a new storm was about to hit. As the raiders drew closer, the clans took their positions, hidden in the dense forests and hills surrounding the ranch. Samuel had spent years studying the land, and he knew it well enough to know where the raiders would most likely attack. The clans were ready. They waited in silence, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the distant howls of wolves. It wasn't long before the raiders appeared on the horizon, their horses moving like shadows against the setting sun. They were large in number, their warriors armed with weapons that gleamed in the dim light. Samuel's heart beat faster as he watched them approach, but he remained calm. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The raiders came closer, and just as they entered the open space, the clans attacked. From all sides, the warriors emerged, catching the raiders by surprise. The battle was fierce, but the clans fought with determination and unity. They used the terrain to their advantage, ambushing the raiders from hidden positions, forcing them into a corner. Samuel and Conthi fought side by side, their movements in sync as they took down raider after raider. Iana led the Black River warriors in a flanking maneuver, driving the raiders back with precision and strength. The raiders, though numerous, were not prepared for the strength and unity of the Apache clans. In a matter of hours, the battle turned in their favor. The raiders were defeated, their retreating forces scattered in the wind. But the victory came at a cost. Several warriors had been injured, and there was the heavy weight of loss that always accompanied battle. As the dust settled, Samuel stood amidst the aftermath, his heart heavy but proud. The clans had united once again, not just to defend the land, but to protect the future they had built together. Kanthi approached him, his expression somber but resolute. "We did it," he said quietly. "The land is safe for now." Ayana, her face marked with the signs of battle, nodded. "But we cannot rest. We must continue to stand together, always." Samuel looked out across the land, the vast expanse that had once been the source of so much conflict, now a symbol of unity. The clans had faced their first real test, and they had come through it stronger. But Samuel knew that peace, like the land, was fragile. It had to be nurtured, protected, and earned every day. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a golden glow across the valley, Samuel felt a sense of quiet pride. The land was theirs, and together, they had proven that they could protect it. But the real test was yet to come. The challenge of keeping the peace, of ensuring that the clans would never return to the violence of the past. The journey had only just begun. The battle against the raiders had left the land scarred, but the Apache clans had emerged victorious. The sun was now rising over Samuel's ranch, casting a soft, golden light on the field where the warriors had fought the day before. The sound of hooves had faded, but the silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stood alone at the edge of the land, gazing out over the fields he had worked so hard to cultivate. His hands were calloused, his body tired, but there was something in his heart that had changed. The clans had come together in the face of danger, and together they had defended the land. It was a victory, but not without its cost. Many warriors had been injured, and the scars of battle would remain for a long time. Yet, there was a new sense of unity, a bond that had been forged in the heat of conflict. As the days passed, the healing began. The warriors of both clans worked side by side, tending to the wounded and repairing what had been damaged. The land, too, began to recover. The irrigation systems, though disrupted by the battle, were quickly repaired. The crops that had been threatened by the flood now stood tall in the fields. It was as if the land itself was reborn. But Samuel knew that peace, even the hard-won kind, was fragile. The clans had united for one purpose, to protect the land, but he feared that the next test might tear them apart. The memories of their past conflicts were still fresh, and trust was not easily built. One evening, as the clan leaders gathered around the council fire, Samuel stood before them. "We've won the battle, but the war is far from over," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of truth. "We've proven that we can defend this land, but we have to prove that we can keep it." Kanthi, the Thunderfoot leader, nodded, his face grim. "We fought side by side. But what happens when the raiders are gone? What happens when the next threat comes? Or worse, when there is no threat at all?" Ayana, the leader of the Black River tribe, spoke next, her voice calm but firm. "We cannot wait for war to bring us together. We must find a way to build something stronger than just a temporary truce." Samuel looked at the two leaders, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. "You're right. The only way to keep the peace is to ensure that it is worth something. We can't rely on fear to keep us united. We have to build trust, not just between our clans, but within them." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Samuel knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The clans had worked together out of necessity, but now they had to work together because they believed it was the right thing to do. They had to build a future where conflict was not the default, where cooperation was not just a strategy, but a way of life. The next few weeks were filled with difficult conversations and hard decisions. Samuel worked closely with both Kanthi and Ayana to create a new structure, a council that would give both clans an equal voice in the decisions that affected them all. It wasn't a perfect system, and there were still those within the clans who resisted the change, but it was a start. The council was formed, and for the first time, both tribes had a say in how the land would be managed and protected. But even with the council in place, Samuel knew that the true test of peace would come when the first real disagreement arose. And when that moment came, he had to make sure that the council, not the past, would guide them. One evening, Not long after the council had been established, a dispute broke out over the division of land. A small section of the ranch had been set aside for the construction of a new settlement, but both clans wanted control of the area. The arguments were heated, the old grudges rising to the surface. Samuel knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything could either fall apart or come together. He called for an emergency council meeting, and the warriors gathered once again. This time, the stakes were higher. Samuel stood before the council, his heart pounding in his chest. "We've come this far," he said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "But now we have to prove that we can settle our differences without bloodshed. The land is not ours to fight over. It belongs to all of us." The room fell silent as the clan leaders exchanged wary glances. Samuel continued, "We've fought for survival. Now it's time to fight for our future. This land can be the foundation of something better than we've ever had before, but only if we choose to work together." After a long pause, Kanthi spoke. "You're right, Samuel. The land is for all of us, and we must share it." Ayana nodded in agreement. "The future belongs to those who choose peace." The council meeting ended with a new agreement, one that divided the land fairly and ensured that both clans had equal access to the resources. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As Samuel stood at the edge of the ranch that evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains, he knew that the battle for peace was far from over. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it was possible. The land, the clans, and the future they were building together were stronger than any conflict that had come before. Peace had been forged in the fires of war, and now, it was up to them to keep it alive. As the seasons continued to change, the Apache clans on Samuel's land had settled into a new rhythm. The first years had been difficult, filled with conflict, fear, and distrust. But now, the land seemed to breathe with life, richer, fuller, and more vibrant than ever before. The crops grew tall and strong, the cattle grazed peacefully across the open fields, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the air as families from both clans came together to celebrate their shared life. Samuel had watched all of this unfold with a sense of pride. He had never imagined that his quiet life as a rancher would lead him to become the leader of something so much larger. Yet, here he was, watching as the land, once a battleground, had transformed into a symbol of unity and hope. The council that he had helped create had grown into a true foundation for their future. It wasn't just a place where decisions were made. It was where trust was built, where ideas were shared, and where the Apache clans could come together as one. There were still challenges, of course, old wounds, though healing would never completely disappear. But the work they had done, the lives they had rebuilt, were proof that peace was possible, even for people who had been enemies for generations. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Samuel stood alone on the ranch, his hands resting on the wooden fence that had stood as a witness to all that had changed. He looked out at the land, feeling the cool breeze against his face, and realized just how much had been accomplished. But there was more to do. There would always be more work. Ayana, Kanthi, and the other leaders had come to him with a new proposal, one that would bring the two clans even closer. They wanted to create a new home, a new village that would be a symbol of their unity. A place where both clans could live, work, and raise their children side by side. It was a bold idea, but one that Samuel believed in. After everything they had been through, they deserved this chance, a chance to build something that would last for generations. The plans for the new village began to take shape. The elders from both clans worked together, guiding the younger generations in the construction of homes, gathering the resources they needed, and building the infrastructure that would sustain their new way of life. Samuel, Ayana, and Kanthi continued to work side by side, leading the efforts with the same determination they had shown during the battle against the raiders. The village grew quickly, its foundations strong and solid, just like the unity that had emerged between the clans. But even as the new village began to take shape, Samuel knew that this was just one chapter in a much larger story. The peace they had fought for would need to be nurtured, and it would require constant effort to maintain. As time went on, more settlers from surrounding areas arrived, drawn by the stories of the peaceful land where two once warring tribes had found common ground. Some came to trade, some to build new lives, and some to learn from the example set by the Apache clans. Samuel's role as leader grew, and with it, his responsibility. But with Ayanna and Kanthi by his side, he felt confident that they could continue to build something greater than just land. They were building a future. The years passed, and the once divided Apache clans became a community, bound together not just by the land, but by the shared experiences of working through hardship and conflict. The village flourished, a testament to the strength and resilience of its people. Samuel often looked back on those early days, remembering the struggles, the battles, and the uncertainty. But he also saw how far they had come. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of doubt. But the community they had built was strong, and its foundation was unshakable. One afternoon, as Samuel sat by the fire, he watched the children of both clans playing together, laughing, and sharing their toys. It was a sight that once seemed impossible. He smiled to himself, knowing that this peace, was the legacy they would leave behind. A legacy of unity, of strength in the face of adversity, and of the belief that people, no matter their differences, could come together and create something greater than the sum of its parts. Samuel stood up from the fire, looking out over the land that had once been a battleground. Now, it was a symbol of hope and renewal. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Samuel knew that the peace they had fought for was not just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of a new era, one that would last for generations to come.